And joining us live now is Keith Mackey, president of Mackey International and a former pilot. Keith, thanks so much for joining us. So I know the fire chief has asked us not to speculate, but you're a former pilot. So I want to ask you, given that the airport reopened at 5 p.m., about 3 hours after the crash, witness accounts of how hard that landing was and the wings coming off, the tail of the plane coming off, it flipping over. What is your take of what could have possibly happened here, given that there were no crosswinds?
Well, actually, there were crosswinds. The wind was blowing at about 37 knots from 270 degrees, and it was gusting. It was less than that sometimes, and gusting to that number other times. So that's a substantial crosswind. I would imagine it approaches the certification limits of the airplane. In other words, that's all the airplane's allowed to use for a crosswind. Now, I've come across 2 video clips in the last few minutes showing the aircraft touching down and then rolling down the runway while it's on fire. The airplane appeared to touch down on the right main gear first, from my observation, very hard. There was no flare at all, I didn't see, and that's probably what caused the right wing to fail. And once that failed, it was nothing much anybody could do. It was out of control, just rolling down the runway. And we're certainly lucky we didn't have more of a fire than what we did.
Yeah, Keith, based on what you just described, do you think the plane should have been allowed to land? Well,
each aircraft has certification limits as to what they can handle as far as crosswind. My personal experience is I flew the 747, and I remember the maximum crosswind was 38 knots. And I had to make a 38-knot crosswind landing when I was fairly new on it. And it wasn't bad at all. I was certainly puckered doing it, but it worked out well. So if it's certified to do it, it can certainly do it.
Yeah, it's interesting, Keith, because, we've been hearing reports from airport officials and the fire chief there saying there were no crosswinds and conditions were clear on the runway. I want to get to when we might possibly hear more from the pilots or the crew members on board. Do you think that in an investigation like this, we'll be hearing from them, or do they have to remain quiet during this time?
I think they would use spokesmen to convey their message, and I think it will all go through Transport Canada, which will be in charge of investigating the accident. And they just do an excellent job. They've got some really qualified people there. It'll work out fine. But, the weather that I observed during these clips, it certainly was snowing and the visibility was limited. So it certainly wasn't a perfect weather day, as was discussed by the fire chief. I would differ, unless the videos that I saw were not authentic.
Right, yeah, that's a good point. We do have to authenticate these things. That's why we're not running a couple of them, because we're trying to make sure of that, Keith. But I know the videos you're referring to. My other question for you is, have you ever seen the wings come off a plane like that? I mean, they just snapped off like almost Lego toys.
No, that's a puzzling thing for me. I just did not see how that could happen. But watching the video that I saw, it clearly hit on the right gear. And when it did, it hit hard. And I think it failed the structure of the right wing attach points. And the wing is probably laying back along the runway somewhere. I'm sure they found it. But it wasn't obvious in any of the pictures. And none of the pictures really showed the left side of the aircraft very well. That one does there. You can see the left wing in that picture.
Yeah.
And that's one. It's just rolled up into a ball.
Keith, so it sounds like to me you're saying that, the weather conditions weren't perfect in this case. You're not exactly saying it was the cause of this crash. But given that the weather conditions were dicey or not ideal, do you think that the airport should have reopened at 5 p.m. a few hours after the crash?
Well, there's no reason to keep it shut. It has many runways, and they didn't have to use the runway with the airplane that was damaged. So there would be no reason not to open the airport. And the airplane certainly had the necessary wind and weather minimums, or the pilots would not have elected to land, and the airport would not have allowed them to land. So I think that the conditions were within limits of the aircraft's operating capability.
Keith, I suppose the one thing that the investigators have going for them is the fact that everybody did survive, including the pilots. So, you can get the black boxes, which you generally get when you don't get to hear from anybody else. But they're going to have a ton of information that goes into this, aren't they? This is really going to be an investigation that sort of has everything covered.
Well, yes, that's what we're going to do now. First step will be to preserve the perishable things on the airplane. Not pick the airplane up initially, document everything, where everything was found, the condition of everything, and all these things will go together to be able to solve the puzzle. But I think this is not going to be very difficult to solve, because I think a lot of the information will be from the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder, which will record all the conversations in the cockpit as we went through the landing procedure, as well as the position of all the controls, so we can see exactly where the pilots positioned the controls that caused this to happen.
Okay, well, it looks like we're definitely going to be in for more answers. It's just going to take a little time. Keith Mackey, president of Mackey International and former pilot, thank you so much for your time and insight this morning.
Thanks,
Appreciate
Keith.
it.
You're very welcome.